Let's talk about the 5 focusing steps. The 5 focusing steps are identify, exploit, subordinate, elevate, and repeat. And it's an iterative process. It's not a one and done. It's something that we are going to do multiple times as we meet and talk and innovate around efficiency. The goal is to discover individually and eliminate individually constraints against the system. And the way we do that is we identify and then prioritize those constraints. And then once we prioritize them, we take the one that has the most impact and we push it through this system in order to break the constraint. The goal is what we call organizational focus. In other words, awareness of and being beholden to these constraints on a system, which can affect our ability to deliver value. What's a non-constraint? Well, everything in a system that is not a constraint is something that we very specifically call out as something we don't focus on. Or we might say, if it's not broke, don't fix it. We acknowledge non-constraints. They're important to the delivery of value, but we do not focus on identifying and exploiting non-constraints because they are not the cause of our problems. It's the constraints that are affecting our throughput. And although it's not frequently used, I understand that some of his very sincere devotees use the term PUGI, which is an anagram for process of ongoing improvement. And the idea is that we use these 5 focusing steps iteratively and continuously, periodically, on cadence to identify and crush constraints within our system. The first thing we do is we're given a system and we have to think about this system, identify the constraints, as many as we can, in as much detail as we can. And the reason why we want that detail is because we want to find the one thing that is the worst constraint upon a system. Now, remember, when we say system, frequently we don't mean, like an entire company's, large companies, multiple hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of systems. We're probably going to hone in on a value stream, which is either a manufacturing or a lean term for when you start thinking about a product to the time where it actually ends up being used. We try to find the worst constraint, the one that is the biggest offender, the weakest link in the chain, and we do not focus on or worry about the strong links at all. We do not focus on non-constraints. As John Carmack, the CTO of Oculus, said, focus is a matter of deciding what things you're not going to do. It's very important not to squander time focusing on non-constraints. The next thing we do is we have to exploit. And it may seem like a strange sort of negative word, but we continue to use it because it was Dr. Goldstein's word. But what he's saying is, in the sense of exploit means, is that because constraints restrict the flow of value, we exploit it by pushing as much value through the constraint as is without changing it. We maximize our utilization of productivity as much as we can. And while we do that, we're delving into the root causes of the constraint. And the reason we need to do that is we have to start fighting back against the constraint by isolating it and figuring out how to push more throughput through it. If we completely figure it out, if in other words, the constraint goes away, then we will have broken the constraint. We complete the cycle, we identify the next worst offender, and we continue to do this until our system is perfect. And remember, our theory presumes that every system has a constraint. So you can also say that in some sense, there's no such thing as a system without constraints, but we want to minimize the constraints. And I like this quote by Lao Tzu: if you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. Subordinate, also a curious word, but inside this world, it means a very important thing. We know, and we've agreed, that non-constraints provide and produce value faster than constraints. We know that because the definition of a constraint is something that restricts the flow of value. It's very important when we focus not to overproduce input. In other words, not to stack up input in front of a constraint. That will not help. It's also very crucial not to overestimate output. In other words, just because we think we push twice as much through a system does not mean that we're going to get twice as much out in the same time. And what we do is we establish buffers, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and WIP monitoring, work in process or work in progress. Either is acceptable. The correct term is actually work in process, as coined by Deming. But we want to monitor our WIP because WIP will tell us whether we are producing or whether we are thrashing. If our WIP is too high, that's usually an indicator that we're taking on too much and trying to push too much through a constraint. Only those who have the patience to do simple things perfectly ever acquire the skill to do difficult things easily. And now is the time to elevate the constraint. Now is the time where we really, really focus on it. We start to put some money into it. We put energy into it, money, people. We hire people if we need more workers, and we continue to measure to show that our impact is there. We never attempt to remediate until we've exploited and subordinated the constraint, because if we don't completely understand, if we haven't subordinated the constraint, we may risk blowing it up. Investing too soon elevates risk. We want to make absolutely certain that we're making the right decision about how to subordinate a constraint. We have to identify the type of constraint that it is and remediate that constraint with a good. So if we have a people constraint, we can't remediate that with a material solution. We have to, it's a people problem, it's a people solution. As the scientist Galileo said, measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so. And last, reiterating that this is intended to be an iterative process, meaning that it never ends. It continues as long as the value stream is in existence. And we also want to prevent inertia or inaction from becoming a constraint. Once we elevate and break a constraint, we then walk away from it. We don't focus on it anymore because now it has changed from a constraint to a non-constraint. When we iterate, that's also a great time to bring in some retrospection and try to adhere to the 12th principle of the Agile Manifesto, which is periodically we get together and try to do things better. There are very, very, very few very complex systems that have few constraints. Typically, although not necessarily, the more complex the system, the more numerous and complex are the constraints on that system. And as Walt Disney said, I just watched a great thing. I'll pitch a channel on YouTube called Defunct Land that talks about all of the closed, all the cool attractions that you remember as a kid when you went to Disneyland or Disney World that are now closed. I do not like to repeat successes. I like to go on to other things. So once we break a constraint, we walk away and we focused on the next biggest constraint.